This is McCook's Mr. Bill. It's an honor to have you here. Well, 2012 is ending. So what's some of the crazy stories that I have for this year that I haven't put on videos already? Well, the day after the election, I had a lady come up, elderly lady, come up to the candy truck, bought some snow cones for her grandkids, and off they went over to play in the park. She stood there, so we visited a little bit, and I said, "How did you like the election results?" And she said, "Well, there's no question what was going to happen." And she said, "Obama only had one strike against him, whereas Romney, he had 2 strikes against him." And I had to ask. I couldn't leave it like that. I said, "What's the strikes against him?" And she, without blinking, said, "Well, Obama is the N-word." And she used a full word. White people know how to say that word. Needless to say, and then she continued, and she said, "Well, Romney, though, he had 2 strikes against him. And the first one is he's a billionaire." She said, "Nobody likes a billionaire. And the second strike is he's a Mormon." And she said, "This country will never elect a Mormon to be president. Never elect a Mormon to be president." Now, I thought that was an interesting twist and open thoughts, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised if there ain't a bucket of people that think just the way she does. That's one of them. 2012 was a strange year, too. It's the first time in my 60 years that we weren't plagued with mosquitoes. In fact, it was into the end of July before I saw my first mosquito on my property. And then there was just a few of them around. It was insane, because most of the time they just gang up you and chase you in, especially when it starts getting evening. But the mosquitoes were gone because it was just so dry in southwest Nebraska. And it didn't end there to tell you about how dry it was. Now, I have farmers hire me about every year to go out and kill rattlesnakes. And I found about the best way to do it is just to walk the fence rows. And I have a pretty good luck of finding rattlers. This year, almost nothing. But at the same time, the first time in my 60 years that I've walked fence rows, as far as that goes, and been around ranches and farms, that you could walk a fence row, and most years, the grasshoppers would explode in the thousands. I mean, they were just everywhere you could see grasshoppers. Not 2012. I walked 1.25 miles of a fence row one day, and I never saw a single grasshopper. And that was the end of August, when most of the time there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, and they're also a good 3 inches long, so you can easily see them. And they weren't there this year. That's how dry it was. Now, the closest I come to fishing is I bought this rod and reel for $1 at a yard sale, put a little doodad on it so I can play catfish, go catfishing, if you will, in my living room, and of course we play with our cat with this. But the best fishing story I heard this year, and of course most fishing stories, they always talk about how big the fish was, and but this is the smallest of fish, minnows. And I got a guy here locally say that he started catching minnows down on the river. He's got permits and licenses and everything like that, nothing illegal. But he was catching minnows and catching as many as he could. What was he doing with them? Using them for bait? No. No, he was putting them in the ground wherever he was putting his plants. Tomato, pepper, corn. He was putting those minnows in there. Now, if you think that's a little bit on the odd side, the Native Americans was doing that centuries before the white man showed up. But that's the first guy I've ever heard catching minnows specifically to garden with. Now, back in 1967, they punched an oil well north of Max, Nebraska. It was the biggest producing oil well in southwest Nebraska. You know, that oil well's still pumping. Still pumping. The only oil well in its area, still pumping oil. I have a hard time thinking that dinosaurs all went over there and died just in that spot. But be that as it may, in the early 1970s, they said we was going to be out of oil in 20 years. 20 years that government lied to us. Your government lied. And then they made us, they doubled the price of fuel, and then they turned around and they made us drive 55 miles an hour for next decade. You bet. And if that wasn't a pain, you bet, driving 55 miles an hour. What a joke. With that in mind, though, 2012 proves them just that much bigger liars. Because in southwest Nebraska, we've had almost 200 oil wells drilled and tapped and ready to go and pumping oil in just 1 year. 200 oil wells almost. South of Trenton, it almost looks like some of the oil fields of Texas. And of course, over at Max, they got 18 oil wells punched over there just south of town. Now, I'm here to tell you, there's some oil in this country, and they lied to us. And as far as that oil goes, that one guy said his oil well, the first one he hit, gives him $100,000 every quarter. $100,000 every quarter. $400,000 a year, just for owning the ground and his share of the oil. Pretty fair paycheck, in my humble opinion. But needless to say, in 2012, it was a year of the drought. No question, the worst I've ever seen in my 60 years. But at the same time, the blessing is oil. And maybe it'll be Nebraska that gets us off the oil from the Middle East and tell them guys they can just go to Hades. Rate this film.